fertile, rich land. Soil was, in fact, the name of it means house of bread, because the soil in and around Bethlehem was perfect for growing grain. And when we consider the things that we've already studied, back in Deuteronomy, we talked about how God had promised Israel that he would always make the land available to his people, and that there would always be plenty in the land. So as long as they remained faithful and obedient, God would always provide. All right? So the fact that there's a famine points us to Israel's continuing to disobey God's law and God's rule. It was a judgment for the people of Israel and their rebellion against God's will. It is, and you're about 2 paragraphs ahead of me, because that's going to continue to point. Here's what's great about Ruth. Like, we're going to knock out all the bad stuff right out of the gate, and then it's going to be nothing but goodness for the rest of the way, right? Well, Bethlehem's definitely pointing us to Jesus, right? The Judah, all that's pointing us to Jesus. But yes, I'm gonna reveal that to you here in just a minute. Spoiler alert. All right, so when times got tough in Bethlehem, Elimelech leaves and he travels to this pagan country called Moab. And the text tells us that they were sojourning to Moab, which means that they had intentions to return to Bethlehem eventually, right? So this wasn't a permanent stay. This wasn't just them moving to a new land to stay forever. They had always planned on coming back. Now, I want to point out a few things about this journey, because, again, it's the negative stuff that continues to point us to disobedience so that we can restore everything here in just a minute. In order to get from Bethlehem to Moab, they had to travel east and hike through the Jericho Pass. After they made it through the pass, they would have to go into the Judean wilderness just north of the Dead Sea. And after that, they finally had to cross back over the River Jordan before they could enter the land of the Moabites. I want to point this out because they're literally heading in the wrong direction from everything God has done for them to this point. Remember how they wandered through the wilderness and across the Jordan River into the Promised Land? Now we're heading back out into the wilderness, back across the Jordan River and into the land of the Moabites. That was a very pagan culture. They worshipped a lot of different gods. They are literally walking away from everything God had already commanded and everything God had already promised, both literally and figuratively. I thought that illustration was very interesting. Not only are they leaving the Promised Land, but they're also walking away from God's provision, God's protection, God's willingness to help his people to prosper. They're walking away from his blessings, right? Not only that, but the Moabite tribes were actually descendants from Moab, the son of Lot. And Moab was actually the result of an incestuous relationship, and that was a nation that was not blessed the way Israel was. So everything about them traveling to Moab itself, the people that were there, all points us to disobedience. And again, it's these echoes of the culture in Israel at the time, these very impulsive, disobedient decisions that they were making. As soon as there's trouble, impulsively, Elimelech packs up his family and he walks away from God and walks towards the descendants of Lot and the sin that they were continuing to engage in. So everything to this point is wrong. It is not God's plan for them. It never was. But they thought they were making the right decision. Unfortunately, it's not really how things played out right here. Elimelech left Bethlehem in search of a better life, but things didn't get any easier in Moab. Elimelech soon died. Naomi's 2 boys married Moabite girls, which was forbidden. It was against the law, God's law. They were not to intermarry with those neighboring tribes. And so when we start to kind of piece all of this together, I feel like it's pointing us towards punishment. I think the fact that Elimelech took his family away, maybe God's judgment came down on Elimelech, and he died. The boys married Moabite women against God's command. That was not his will for them, so they too died, right? So to answer your question, they were not supposed to do any of that. In fact, they should have just stayed in Bethlehem, and everything would have been okay. I think that will come clear as we go through this as well. All right, so let's keep reading. Look at verse 6. And also to your point, Travis, in this culture, a childless widow was pretty much on the bottom rung of social status and social structure. They had no way to take care of themselves. They had no way to buy property. They typically didn't work. I mean, they were completely helpless. They had nobody to provide, protect, help them prosper. No land, no heir to the family name, none of that. So all of that was gone, and so they were really looked down on in terms of society and culture. Verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law and to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to the daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. All right, so right here we start to see the changing of the guard. Things are starting to, we're going to start moving away from this disobedience, and we're starting to look at this character of Naomi and her faithfulness and her desire to return home. Apparently she's out in the field, and while she's working, trying to glean food for herself, she hears that the God of Israel has returned to Israel, and now they're being blessed again. They're prospering again. And so she decides she wants to go home. Why wouldn't she? Right? She's lost her husband. She's lost her boys. There's nothing left for her here. Everything's doing better in Bethlehem. So she's going to go home. And so she approaches her daughters-in-law and lovingly wants them to stay. This is where you're from. Return to your mother's house. Stay here where you're familiar with everything, where you know these people. When Naomi left, she was forsaking her land, her home, and moving to a new land, and now she's wanting to return back. This is her turning back. It's almost like a repentance act, literally and figuratively, that she's turning back away from that disobedience, going back to God's provisions and back to God's promise. I love that Naomi stops here and prays for Ruth and Orpah. And we know that this is a prayer because of how she's using the language, how it's addressed. May the Lord deal kindly. This phrase, deal kindly, actually represents more than just these words of being kind to someone, but it encompasses this idea of mercy and a third party acting, a third party that's more powerful, acting for another party of lesser significance. So it's literally this image of God bless and be graceful to my daughters-in-law. They've been so kind to me. They've been so good to me. They helped me when my husband passed. They helped me when my sons passed. She wants them to deal kindly. We also get a glimpse into this relationship that Naomi had with her Moabite daughter-in-laws. They hugged. They wept. She's not wanting them to stay for any other reason than she thinks that's what's best for them. And so Orpah agrees. With tears, she does agree, and she decides to stay. But Ruth, on the other hand, decides she's going to go. So let's skip down to verse 15 and see how this plays out. And she said, See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything, but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. All right, so now we're starting to get a glimpse into the faith and the obedience and this virtuous character of Ruth as she declines Naomi's request for her to stay. She says, no, I'm going to go with you. And this is the section of Ruth I think that we all know the best, right? Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Ruth was raised in a pagan culture with a variety of gods. But there was something in Naomi through all of these 10 plus years that has revealed a kind of faith that attracted Ruth. Ruth saw Naomi's character. She saw her faith. She wanted the same faith. She wanted that same obedience to the one true God. And so now we start to see Ruth leaning into God, to the God of Israel, and desiring to to walk into his promises and into his blessings. And so whenever we're reading through this, we see this word, when she clings to her. It actually represents more of just being close to someone. It actually has more of a marriage relationship type of representation. And we even have language in here, "till death do me part." Like this is more than just a mother-in-law. This is a deep relationship that's just a beautiful picture of what all relationships between God's people should be. This desiring to do what's best for someone else, this desiring to serve and to make sacrifices on behalf of the people around you that you love, this unconditional love. Skip down to verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. All right, so now we're starting to get a little time frame that's going to set up the rest of the story. So how does Ruth respond whenever she lost her husband, and how does her response point us to how we should respond in the face of tragedy? So Ruth's husband died, Naomi's husband died, Orpah's husband died. How does Ruth respond? Did she go home? Did she go to her mom's house? I think she leaned in more to her mother-in-law. She stayed faithful. Ruth has no obligation to Naomi whatsoever. None. Naomi's from Israel, Ruth's from Moab. Two completely different countries, different religions, different everything. Son is gone. There's no lineage there. There's nothing now connecting Ruth to Naomi other than what was. But there's no one to fill that gap. Yet, Ruth is still at Naomi's side, refuses to leave Naomi. And watch what happens when we turn the page here. Go to chapter 2. As soon as we get to Bethlehem, watch what happens. Verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of a clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall go find favor." And she said to her, "Go so, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the fields after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field that belonged to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. As soon as they get to Bethlehem, Ruth takes it upon herself to provide for Naomi. Ruth is the one that says, "I'm going to go out in the fields and I'm going to gather food for us so that we have all that we need to survive." That is the type of love, this unconditional love that this idea of a marriage relationship and the language that was used in chapter 1 is really pointing us to. Ruth had no obligation to do any of this. In fact, it was Naomi who was on the field gleaning in Moab when she heard that the Lord had returned to Israel. So Naomi was working because she didn't have a husband. Naomi was having to work because she didn't have sons. But now once they get home, because of the love that Ruth has for Naomi, she takes it upon herself to go out into the fields and glean and work and serve, to provide and to protect and to help her mother-in-law. It's a beautiful picture of what a relationship with all of our mother-in-laws should be. I'm pretty blessed. I've got a great mother-in-law. But we're also introduced to a new character here in verse 1, a man named Boaz. And we're told that Boaz is a relative of Elimelech. A couple different translations, when you put them all together, we find out that he's a worthy man, that he is a wealthy man. And just a side note, who was Boaz's mom? Rahab. Right? Rahab, who helped Joshua's spies flee from Jericho before God destroyed it. Right? You see this lineage connecting us, these Gentile women who are going to continue to get us to the lineage of Christ and the ultimate plan for redemption. What I love about this, and this is we lose the language here when we translate it from Hebrew into English, but there's a word that's used here for relative that is very significant, and it's called goel, G-O-E-L. It's a Hebrew word that represents more than just a relative. It speaks specifically to what it translates to is kinsman redeemer. All right? And so it had very, very specific meaning and a very defined role in the house of Israelites. It not only spoke to the head of the household, the chieftain of the house, but it also the way it was originally in the Bible, in the text, the way it was originally used, it described the person who was responsible as the avenger of blood, meaning that if anybody committed sins against the family, it was the kinsman's redeemer's responsibility. It was the goel's responsibility to go and restore what was taken, or to make right what was wronged. It also speaks to the person responsible for buying back property. So if something like this happened, where Naomi's husband died and her boys died, and she's left, and it's just 3 women that are widowed, and they lose their property, it's foreclosed on, it was this kinsman's redeemer's responsibility to go and buy back that property for those women. All right? The other thing was, this kinsman redeemer would be responsible for marrying any childless widow and providing them with a son to carry on that family name. And so, to kind of simplify all this, Boaz, as this relative, which translates to kinsman redeemer, he would have been responsible for keeping the family safe. He would have been responsible for helping the family prosper. He would be the one that was taking care of the family property. He was the one that would protect and keep the family secure and safe. And so it wasn't just a cousin, a relative. It was a kinsman redeemer, the head of the house that had a laundry list of responsibilities to take care of and to provide for his family. And this Boaz is not only the kinsman redeemer, but he's also a good man, a wealthy man, and an Israelite in Bethlehem. All right, and so during this famine, when Elimelech and his family decide to leave the promised land, it feels like they're punished. They receive judgment for their disobedience, while Boaz stays in Israel, and he is blessed by staying. Nobody went hungry. There was a famine. There was a shortage of food, but nobody starved. God still continued to provide for Israel. They still had food. They still had wheat. Boaz was blessed. Elimelech and his family apparently was judged, and now all the men are gone, and it's just these women. Elimelech had, I feel, good intentions, but this impulsive act of disobedience to leave the promised land, to go to this pagan country, it just reminds us of all that Israel was doing in the book of Judges, this constant disobedience, this living for self, no sacrifice, impulse, sin, running away from God. But now everything's starting to come back, and our kinsman redeemer has now entered the story. And so let's see how some of this plays out. Let's keep reading. Let's pick back up in verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to his reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." How does Boaz address his reapers, his servants here? What's he say? Not all at once. What's it say? Right there in verse 4. That's his greeting. Not good morning, you missed a spot. Hey, let's hustle today. It looks like the rain's coming in. No, hey, good morning, guys. I hope the Lord blesses you today. I mean, this is our introduction to Boaz. He's a good man. He's a wealthy man. He's our kinsman redeemer. And as soon as he speaks, the first words out of his mouth are, "The Lord bless you." And look how they respond. Don't people tend to respond to their fathers, their bosses at work in kind of the same way that they're treated? They respond the exact same way. "The Lord be with you," and then they respond with, "The Lord bless you." Right? This loving relationship between reapers and the owner of the property. Right? Again, this is just giving us a good picture of the high character that Boaz possesses. Absolutely. What she was and then what she became. You're right. You're right. started out as a Gentile but raised an Israelite son, right? All right, so let me kind of frame this up because I think this is important. In Leviticus 19, God gives Israel very specific instructions on how to harvest their grain. And to just simplify it, God basically told them to cut corners. That they're not going out and picking every single stalk and every single bit of grain. He wanted them to leave some behind. He also told them that if they dropped anything while they were harvesting, to just leave it and move on. He did this for a couple of different reasons. One, it's so the poor could come in behind them and glean from those same fields so that they could have food. And not just a little bit, but in abundance. Still on the stalks, still in the field, and anything that fell. And so this was God not only teaching the farmers to be generous with their harvest, but also showing the poor how to be grateful for those that are providing for them. And it was God's way of kind of setting up a system within Israel to take care of everybody, right? And so when we see Ruth going into the field to glean, it speaks to her the poverty that they were in, right? So she would have been dressed a certain way. She would have been dressed as a poor widow. You could have looked at Ruth on the street and known she was a poor widow, right? And so through divine providence, God helps Ruth stumble upon this field that belonged to Boaz because God knows that Boaz is going to be her kinsman redeemer. And so she's out in the field and she's going to start gleaning, and these two are going to meet and start having a little bit of a relationship. Let's keep reading, verse 5. Then Boaz said to the young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in any other field or leave this one, but keep close eye on my young women. Let your eyes be on the fields that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged that the young men do not touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of her husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." All right, so we get our first little interaction between Ruth and Boaz. And it's just more of this beautiful picture of what people of God should do and how they're supposed to treat the people around them. Boaz apparently has heard all of the good things and the great things that Ruth has done for Naomi. He's impressed, and so he gives Ruth full access to his field. But not only that, he also tells her to stay close to the women, stay in a group. He's also charged the men that are doing the reaping in his field, do not touch her. He's also giving her water, giving her food. He's giving her more than what she can actually gather herself, right? So we see all the elements of this kinsman redeemer being played out right here in just this short paragraph. Boaz is going to protect her. He's going to help her prosper. He's going to make sure she has provision. He's going to make sure that she has an abundance of everything she needs. She's going to make sure she has all the access to the land. He's doing everything that the chieftain of the house, the chieftain relative, the head of the household, should be doing for his relatives, right? So it's this beautiful picture of what redemption looks like and what it's going to point us to as we continue to walk through the rest of this book. So as Boaz begins to step into this role as kinsman redeemer, he's going to invite Boaz over for meal. So let's just keep reading. Verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers and he passed to her the roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed the young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her." And also pull out from the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So not only is he giving her access to all this, he even invites Ruth to come in and have a meal with him, right? And there's kind of a romantic gesture here when he says, here, you can dip your bread in this wine, right? A very, very, very nice gesture on Boaz's part. I don't know if she double dipped or not, but maybe even more romantic if she did. So not only does he do that, but he pulls out more wheat from the sheaves that they've already bundled up, and he's stacking that up for her. And he's telling everybody, don't ask questions, just let her take whatever she wants. Like, he's going above and beyond in all areas to make sure that not only Ruth, but Naomi is taken care of as well. Because Naomi is the connection here in this relationship as a relative. So she gleans the field all evening, and it's just this beautiful picture. So let's jump down here to verse 21. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said, or let me scoot up to 20. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers, right? So now Naomi sees what's going on. She sees this relationship between Ruth and Boaz beginning to form, and she decides that she wants to play matchmaker. Why didn't y'all tell me that thing had a thing on it? It's not even a PowerPoint, but I can at least... I feel better about that. Where was that? Anyway, Naomi decides she's going to try to play matchmaker. She introduces this idea to Ruth that Boaz is a relative, but not just any relative, but he's our redeemer, right? So according to the law, if an Israelite man passed away, his widowed bride would be given to the next brother in line, and it was that brother's responsibility to become that kinsman redeemer. He would provide for her, protect for her. He would be the one that would help her carry on the family name by providing her with a son. Like, that's just the way the culture went. It just went on down the line. And there was no other siblings, and so it kind of just keeps getting passed to the next relative. And now Naomi finally tells Ruth that, I know Boaz, he's a relative, not just any relative, he's our redeemer, right? So I want you to keep working this relationship. He might be the person that you need to be with, all right? So let's turn over to chapter 3 and see if he's the man, if he's the one that she's supposed to be with. Right? And I love that every time we turn the page, it's just more validation of the character and the faith and the obedience of Ruth and Naomi and the goodness of Boaz. It's just a wonderful picture. Let's start in verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that I may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young woman you are? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. And do not make yourself known to the man until he is finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say, I will do. All right, so what's going on here? It seems a little suggestive, doesn't it? A little aggressive. Maybe in our culture it does, but that is not that's not what's taking place here. Naomi finds out that Boaz is the field where she's gleaning. He's our redeemer. So she says, here's what I want you to do. And she gives her some very specific instructions. In fact, the word that's used here for security is the same word that was used in chapter 1, verse 9, that means rest, in terms of hoping that Ruth can find a husband in a home where she can actually find rest. It's a beautiful picture of what, it's not just security, but it is a loving home. Family home. But as Naomi realizes this, she gives her some very specific instructions. So when it's at the end of the harvest, which we read in chapter 2, at the end there, we get into chapter 3, and this idea of a threshing floor, this was an interesting time. At the end of the harvest was really when all the thieves came out, and they would try to go in and steal as much from these harvesters as they could. And so either the reapers or the owners of these fields would sleep, and the threshing floor is kind of the entrance into where they store their grain. They would come in at the end of the day hot, sweaty, dirty, and they would just lay across the floor. So if an intruder tried to break in, they literally had to step over them, hopefully waking them up, and they'd be able to catch them, and they wouldn't be able to get robbed. And so at the end of the night, Boaz eats, he's filled, he's satisfied, and he goes to sleep. And so Naomi says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get cleaned up. I want you to take off those widow clothes, those poverty clothes. I want you to put on your best dress. I want you to smell really nice. I want you to wait till Boaz has eaten, gotten his fill, and laid at the threshing floor. And once you've seen where he lays, I want you to just wait, right? This idea of uncovering his feet was literally a symbolic of Ruth asking Boaz to be her kinsman redeemer without actually saying it. That's what uncovering the feet represented. Laying at his feet is also a beautiful representation of submission and humility. The idea is that laying at his feet as a servant waiting on the commands of the master. The master wakes up in the middle of the night, I need some water. She goes and gets some water. It's an act of submission to someone else. So in the act of uncovering the feet and submitting to Boaz, she is submitting to her kinsman redeemer. So sometime in the middle of the night, whenever I first read this years ago, I thought that the idea was uncovered his feet so that the feet got cold, and then that would wake him up because his feet were cold, and then he would see that she's there, and then they would have a conversation. But that's not how this plays out. It's just symbolic of asking the question without asking the question. It is. I mean, it makes a whole lot more sense, doesn't it? Right. It is not suggestive in any way. No. And so in the middle of the night, Boaz is startled awake. It's really dark outside. He doesn't know what's going on. And so once he's startled, look at verse 9. He says, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Right? This is her now asking, I want you to be my kinsman redeemer. You're a relative. I'm a widow. Legally, this is what we do. Right? And look how Boaz responds. And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made these last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." Like, I don't want us to lose sight of what's going on here, because this is a beautiful picture of the character of both Ruth and of Boaz. Ruth came to claim her right. Ruth was a widow, and she had the right to seek her Redeemer. But she doesn't force herself on. She doesn't come to Boaz as a victim, as a sorrowful widow begging for redemption. She does exactly what Naomi asked her to do, according to the law. Right? So that actually speaks to not only Naomi's faith and her obedience to God's instruction to Israel, but also to Ruth's faith, not only in Naomi, but also into the one true God of Israel. So it's like a 2-for-1. It's just a beautiful picture. Boaz was that Goel. He was that kinsman redeemer, and Ruth had every right to expect him to redeem her. And on the other side of that, Boaz had every right as that redeemer to force himself onto Ruth, but he doesn't. He obviously knew that he was the Redeemer, the way it says it here. I am a Redeemer. I know I am your Redeemer. But yet he waits for Ruth to ask for that redemption before he provides it. And he doesn't hesitate. He says, absolutely, everybody knows you're a woman of high character, myself included. And what I love here is this mention of younger men. Like, you didn't pursue younger men. It doesn't seem like there's anything, it doesn't seem like they're attracted to each other physically. Like, this is all about who they are, their character. Boaz likes Ruth because she's a woman of integrity. In fact, the word that's used here that Boaz used to describe Ruth is hayil. I don't speak Hebrew, so that's my best interpretation. But it literally means moral strength or integrity, right? And it's the same language used when the Bible describes mighty men of valor. Right? So it speaks to that courageous, integrity, sacrificial actions. And so they're talking back and forth to each other in honorable ways, in obedient terms, not just it wasn't physically attracted to you, but man, you're such a great person. You're such a great person. Everybody knows you're great. No, you're great. I guess they can't outdo each other with kindness type of conversation. It's a beautiful picture of love. So, but there's a problem. There is a Redeemer nearer than I, right? So there was a line. It went to the oldest brother, then the youngest brother, then the first cousin, then the second cousin, then the nephew. Like it went all the way down the family line. And apparently not only does Boaz know that he can be the Redeemer, but there's also a relative that's closer to Naomi and Elimelech that has that first right. And so even in his willingness to be her Redeemer, he knows that he's not the legal official Redeemer, and he submits to that Redeemer first. Like that's the kind of character that Boaz possessed. That's the type of obedience he has to God's instruction for Israel. He's not willing to cut corners. He's going to do everything just as God had asked. And so when we get to chapter 4, things are going to start to come together. And one thing I love about the book of Ruth is every chapter begins with a need and it ends with the provision, right? And so when we get to chapter 4, man, the relationship's there. I'll be your Redeemer. Please be our Redeemer. Everything's coming together, but we still need the Redeemer to actually step in and redeem Ruth and Naomi. So let's see what happens. I think we know what happens, but let's see how it plays out. Verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gates and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." Now, let me pause. This word friend here translates to, I believe it was so-and-so, like Mr. So-and-so. Like the guy had a name, but the author decided it was not significant for it. It could have been anybody, right? Mr. So-and-so, sit down here. It's not even worth pointing out your name because this is going to work out for our boy Boaz here and not Mr. So-and-so. I thought that was interesting. I don't know why. It doesn't sound as interesting when I say it out loud. But when I read it and put it in my notes, it sounded pretty cool. Mr. So-and-so. I was like, I didn't know there was a Greek word for Mr. So-and-so. And he turned aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and sat down, and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling a parcel of land that belongs to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I will come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Uh-oh. Womp, womp. All right. There's a wife, Naomi. Elimelech's passed. She's come back from Moab, and there's a parcel of land that she once possessed but has now been taken from her, bought by somebody else, and we need somebody to redeem it for her. And this guy says, I will redeem it. Notice how Boaz frames this introduction up in the terms of property, not in terms of people. So the guy's like, yeah, I'll buy the land. I'm looking for some more land, right? Let's see what happens. Then Boaz says, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So as soon as Boaz says, great, you can buy the land and redeem the land, but the land also comes with a woman, and you have to redeem her as well. He says, I can't do that. It's going to affect the inheritance that I already have. And the idea here is that he has older kids, and he's already kind of divvied up the inheritance, and everything has been given out. But now if I bring in another wife, because I'm already married, that's going to be awkward. But if I have another kid, then I've got to redo everything and split up the inheritance again. It's just too much. He says it's not worth it lest I impair my own inheritance. So he says, no, I can't do it. And we've got witnesses. Remember, we brought 10 elders. So there's members of the church that are here to oversee legally this transfer of redemption, this transfer of property. And this, again, was according to the law of Israel that God established. We had to have some witnesses. Verse 7. I love this. Now this was the custom in the former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging, To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. All right, so this is, instead of a handshake or a signature on a contract, they would take off a sandal and give the sandal to the person they were redeeming property or people or whatever from, right? What's interesting is, typically, if it was considered dishonoring if they declined to redeem the property, and in this case, the property and Ruth, and so the widow would come up and spit in the face of the person that was declining the redemption right and would still take the sandal. But because there was no one dishonored here, they just exchanged the sandal. Instead of a handshake, it was a sandal. So I guess the guy went home with one sandal, gave up his right to the sandal. I don't know. I thought that was interesting too. Again, sounded a lot better when I read it and put it in my notes rather than when I'm trying to communicate it to you. But nonetheless, it's the ceremony. You've got witnesses and a sandal to confirm this redeeming of property. Skip down to verse 11. Everyone's come out. They're celebrating. Oh, and then after this little contract, they'd have a big party. And that's what they do. They have a big party. Boaz takes Ruth, and she becomes his wife. And he went to her, and it went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. Skip down to verse 17. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Right? We get this beautiful picture of obedience and faith and love and redemption wrapped up in Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. All of this for one reason, and one reason only. For this son, Obed, who becomes the father of Jesse, who becomes the father of the eventual King David, who becomes the great grandfather of Jesus. Right? All of this is not only a picture of God's redeeming plan for us, it's also literally the lineage for redemption that God has put in place. And starting with Rahab, who has a son, who's a good man, who redeems another Gentile woman, who together have a son that becomes the grandfather of David, who gets us all the way to Jesus. I love how through all of this, up to this point, even through most of the Old Testament and through most of the New Testament, how Gentiles were so looked down upon by the Jews. But God's plan from day one, all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, was for the Gentiles to come to faith as well. God had always said that there was going to be a remnant of believers. And so even in this period of the Judges, when Israel is so just vile and just living a life of debauchery and sin and disobedience, there is a remnant of believers. And in this case, it comes in the form of a widowed Gentile who loves her mother-in-law and is willing to do whatever she needs to do to make sure her mother-in-law is taken care of and provided for. She sees her mother-in-law's faith. She sees her obedience. She wants to worship her God. She wants to be her daughter. She wants to do all these things. And God is able to take this remnant, this one family, and in this one family, restore Israel and us even to this point. So, how does one of the reasons I love this idea of God doing these amazing things through Gentiles like Rahab and then through Ruth is because that speaks to us. A Gentile is just anyone except a Jew. So, not only how does God illustrate His love for Gentiles through this, but what are y'all's thoughts on how this is a jumping off point for us that gets us to Christ? And the fact that God's going to redeem everyone, and He can do it to anybody. And it's this line that gets us to Jesus. What are y'all's thoughts? I mean, we're almost out of time, so overall thoughts. Not a problem. I love how I love that thought, because to me at the beginning there's this impulsive decision, like bad things are happening, we're being punished, and so we've got to make a decision, and we make an irrational, wrong choice, and then we tend to stew in that for a little while. It looks a lot of different ways for a lot of different people, but we eventually see the judgment, we see the error of our way, and we're able to turn and come back and still walk right back into the same blessings, the same provision, the same security, the same prosperity, the same promises that God had established from day one. And He knows we're going to walk away. He knows that. He doesn't want us to. That was never His intention. But He can still use you as long as you're willing to repent, as long as you're willing to turn back and go back and remain obedient and step back into His grace and step back into His blessings. It's a beautiful picture in the middle of horrible. I mean, the book of Judges is brutal. It is brutal what's going on in Israel. Yet, in spite of all of it, this one sweet little lady and this one good man, God's able to restore Israel and literally get us all the way to Christ. Because without this, there's no well, God would have made it happen another way, but this is what gets us to Jesus. This is redemption. This is salvation, and all of it really wrapped up and tied up in a story that kind of points to the exact same redeeming salvation of Christ. It's beautiful. Anybody else got anything? Thoughts? All right, I'm done. Y'all have a good night. Yes, sir. You know what it looked like? It looked like